I had barely finished filling the last inch of my brand new pool, the water catching sunlight like glass, when I heard the sound that would make my jaw clench and my stomach twist. The chorus of flip-flops slapping pavement, voices chattering, and the grating squeal of cheap lawn chairs being dragged along concrete. I turned my head toward the street, coffee still in hand, and there she was, Karen, marching at the head of an entire army of half the neighborhood. No less than 50 people dressed in swimsuits and carrying beach towels, coolers, umbrellas, and inflatable toys as if she had just personally declared herself queen of the summer and ordained my pool as the crown jewel of her reign. Her smile stretched wide, triumphant, a crooked parody of joy that told me this was all her idea, her parade, her conquest. But her steps faltered the moment she heard the metallic clank of my heavy steel chain sliding into place. I pulled the thick links across the gate slowly, deliberately, savoring the silence that followed as her sea of sun hats and sunglasses came to an abrupt and awkward stop at the edge of my property. The padlock snapped shut with a click that seemed to echo down the street, louder than the squeals of kids carrying squirt guns, louder than music leaking from portable speakers. And I leaned back calmly against the fence with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew exactly where the line was drawn. Karen's grin wavered. For one delicious second, her confidence cracked, her eyes widening at the realization that the kingdom she was about to preside over wasn't hers at all. Behind her, the crowd shifted uneasily, confusion and embarrassment fluttering across their faces as they looked from her to the pool glinting like treasure in the sun, and back to me, the man whose hand rested casually on the lock, keeping them all out. That was the moment everything changed. The exact moment I realized this wasn't going to be the laid-back summer I had dreamed of, but a war. A war no one on this block was going to forget anytime soon. The pool had been my dream for as long as I could remember, something I had saved for through years of overtime shifts and weekends, broken by side jobs that left me sweat-soaked and sore but determined. After endless bills and repairs, after trading my free time for paychecks, I had finally handed enough to the contractors to build it. They had worked tirelessly for weeks, laying stone tile, fitting pumps and filters, building a deck where I imagined peaceful evenings spent reading until the sun fell behind the ridgeline, or early dawn swims before work when the world was quiet. When they finished, I remember lowering myself into one of the chairs, sipping a beer and watching how the sunlight scattered in ripples across the water. I smiled to myself because it wasn't just a pool. It was a monument to patience, a reward. It was private mine, the sanctuary I had promised myself. Karen didn't see that. Karen never saw anything for what it truly was. From the moment she spotted the water glinting behind my fence through her upstairs window across the street, her eyes narrowed not in congratulations or neighborly welcome, but like a hawk sighting its prey. I could feel it even before she made her move. She wasn't admiring. She was calculating. That's who Karen was, the kind of neighbor who didn't simply live in the community but embodied it like a sickness. Any new development, any improvement wasn't celebrated. It was scrutinized, cataloged, and somehow rewritten into her kingdom. She had a reputation. She policed front lawns, trash bins, parking spots an inch over the line. She was not just nosy. She was an empire of petty control. The day before the ambush, she marched over while I trimmed the hedges, her voice soaked in fake sweetness, the kind that doesn't fool anyone but pretends to. "I see the pool is finished," she said, smiling wide, folding her arms as though she were the one who had built it. "Wouldn't that be absolutely perfect for the community?" I stood, hedge clippers in hand, sweat dripping off my brow, and told her flatly, "It's not for the community, Karen, it's my pool. On my land." She smirked, tilted her head like she knew some secret, and with the confidence of a dictator declared, "Oh, we'll see about that." I thought it was bluster. Karen blustered on everything. She complained about paint shades as if lives depended on it. She threatened to take it higher when someone left their trash cans out overnight. She fought over things so trivial it was almost comical. I didn't think for a second she'd try more than muttering about how selfish I must be. I was wrong. Because Karen's delusions go further than complaint. They become invitations. The next afternoon, just as I had settled back into a chair with my feet up, I heard it. The sound of chaos marching. I peered through the fence and saw her leading an actual crowd. Kids in neon floaties banging their hands against my fence slats and squirting water guns into the air. Adults dragging coolers, laughing, discussing where to set up a barbecue as though my backyard was a public park. And Karen waving like she was Grand Marshal of the most absurd parade ever staged. She stopped at my gate, beamed at me with a triumphant flourish, and loudly announced, "Welcome to our pool party." The audacity, the sheer delusion, hit so hard I almost broke into hysterical laughter. They came prepared. They looked convinced, and she had somehow convinced them to show up. My jaw tightened, but I said nothing. My hands did the work instead. I walked to the gate, pulled the steel chain across the latch, and let the silence of 50 hopeful guests die with the metallic clank of the lock. The click was louder than any speech I could have given. Karen walked up anyway, chin high, pulling on the gate. When it held firm, she turned on me and demanded, "What do you think you're doing?" And I leaned against the fence, arms folded, voice even. "What do you mean?" "It's my pool, on my land. You're not invited." Her face turned red. She whispered furiously to save face the words, "This is a community event. The HOA has approved it." I laughed. Honest, short, sharp laughter that cut through the crowd. "The HOA doesn't own this pool, Karen, I do. And you can't just invite strangers to my house." The guests stirred. Murmurs spread. One woman whispered she genuinely thought it was communal. A man frowned down at his cooler, muttering that he hadn't signed up for trespassing. Some kids giggled and someone shouted, "Locked out." The chant spread. Teenagers smirked, neighbors snickered. Karen's eyes darted side to side, her smile desperate, twitching. She tried to rally with nonsense about traditions, about shared spaces. Even something so insane it nearly broke me. If it's visible from the street, it's public access. I pressed record on my phone camera for good measure, the red dot glowing. She hissed at me like I'd drawn steel instead of plastic. "Go ahead," I told her calmly. "Tell everyone how you invited 50 people to trespass." More laughter. Guests shifted awkwardly. People began slipping back to their houses, towing embarrassed children, shaking their heads at her. She shouted at them to stay, but her authority was collapsing. She panicked, pulled out her phone, and screamed she was calling the police. "Fine," I said, almost amused now. "Let's see what they say about 50 trespassers and one guy behind his own locked gate." That was the nail. Her army unraveled in mutiny. Someone cursed that they had canceled plans for this. Another accused her of lying again. Karen's voice rose, veins straining, but she was drowning in the noise of those she misled. By the time the crowd had thinned to a scattering of sulking, confused hangers-on, Karen was left gripping the bars of my gate, venom in her eyes, muttering under her breath, "You'll regret this." Maybe she thought it was a threat. To me, it was pathetic. I slipped my phone into my pocket, smirked, and turned back toward the shimmering rectangle of blue water that glistened untouched behind me. My sanctuary was locked, sealed, defended with the simple grace of a chain. The sun reflected in waves across the surface, golden and perfect. The pool was safe, but I could feel it in my bones as I walked away. This was not the end. Karen never ended things quietly. The gate may have shut her out, but humiliation had only turned her pride into fuel. Her next move would come, bigger, pettier, louder. And as I sat back in my chair, listening again to the calm ripple of water, I thought to myself, let her. Because no matter what fire she brings, the lock is louder. And this summer, the war had only just begun. The next morning, I thought maybe Karen would have finally felt the weight of humiliation, heavy enough to push her back into the shadows of her house. For a brief hour, the street was quiet. I sat on my deck with my coffee, listening to the faint hum of the pool filter, the crisp morning air hinting at calm that I knew wouldn't last. Sure enough, just before 9, I saw her crossing the street with her arms folded tightly, her chin cocked upward, and that stiff walk of hers that always carried the theater of control. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. No good morning, no attempt at charm beyond the strained smile plastered across her face. Instead, she launched into accusations the moment she reached my fence, her voice higher pitched than usual, like she had spent the night rehearsing and was now performing on stage. She called me selfish, unneighborly, a disgrace to the spirit of community, as if locking my brand new pool from 50 uninvited strangers during its very first week of life had been a personal act of war against humanity. I let her talk, quiet at first, because Karen has always been her own worst enemy when given the space to speak freely. She rattled off lines about how I was hoarding a luxury that should be shared, muttered about how the HOA rules gave her authority to call for access, then threw in the word responsibility, like my pool was somehow a burden to the neighborhood and not a sanctuary I had spent blood and sweat to pay for. Her arguments tangled themselves up, overlapping until they were incoherent. her hand stabbing the air as if waving at invisible supporters behind her. I sat back in my chair, deliberately calm, until finally my patience wore thin enough to reply. I told her flatly what she already knew. The pool was fully on my deeded land, built with my own funds, permitted by the county, and absolutely private. "You have no right," I said. Her lips curled into a tight sneer, and with a small tilt of her head she spat back, "We'll see how many people agree with you," before spinning dramatically on her heel and striding away toward her house like she had just delivered a courtroom final statement. By lunch, I started to realize exactly what she meant. The neighborhood had begun buzzing, and I hadn't even left my property. I could hear conversations drifting through open windows, snippets of gossip carried from driveways and sidewalks. Word of her 50-guest debacle had already traveled fast, but Karen wasn't telling the story the way it had happened. She was spinning it. In her telling, she hadn't lied to dozens of people and gotten trapped behind a locked gate. No, she had been victimized by me. She told anyone who would listen that I had embarrassed her in front of the community, that I had locked children out in the heat, that I was cruelly hoarding something meant for everyone. By the time I walked the dog later that evening, I caught fragments of it firsthand. 2 women standing by a mailbox whispering that maybe he could have at least let the kids swim for an hour. A man watering his lawn muttering that HOA rules can be complicated while scratching his chin. But I also heard laughter, real laughter, from my other side, from neighbors who were mocking her. One chuckled as he called her the wannabe lifeguard. Another saying loudly that she had been caught on camera pulling on iron bars like a zoo exhibit. It was surreal how quickly reality clouded under rumors, how entitlement spoken loud enough could make polite people pause and wonder if maybe, just maybe, Karen had a point. That pause grew teeth the next afternoon when I found flyers in the mailbox, printed in bold letters accusing me of selfishness and neglect, claiming that our neighbor has refused to share a community amenity, as though my private pool had magically transformed into a neighborhood club facility overnight. At the bottom, in a move that would have been laughable had it not been so audacious, she had included a photograph of the pool she must have snapped through a gap in the fence from her upstairs window across the road. The picture looked like an advertisement for some cheap resort, zooming in to catch the shimmer of the water, captioned with the words, "Unfairly denied to the community." She had even attached a date and time for what she grandly called a neighborhood discussion to address the matter. I held the flyer in my hand, shaking my head, a laugh breaking through my frustration. She was attempting politics now, mobilizing gossip into a weapon. The evening of her so-called meeting, I walked down to the cul-de-sac just to see how far she would take her performance. People had gathered in folding chairs on the little patch of grass, half curious, half entertained, some out of loyalty, others because in any neighborhood drama, there are always spectators. And there stood Karen at the front, clipboard in hand like a campaigner on the rise, her voice carrying with false conviction. She railed about how I had betrayed the neighborhood spirit, about how unsustainable it was for one person to monopolize a resource when children could be splashing in joy. At one point she threw her arms wide toward my fence and shouted that such selfishness was dangerous, divisive, corrosive to community trust. I stood at the edge, leaning against a tree, watching. People nodded politely, but their eyes flickered with discomfort. Not everyone was convinced, not everyone was even engaged, but Karen thrived on filling silence with her voice. And then came the moment that pulled the floor from beneath her. Dave, a practical man from 2 houses down, lifted his hand and asked in plain, measured words, "Karen, is that pool actually built on his private property?" The question landed like a hammer. For the first time all night she faltered. She mumbled something about technicalities, tried to spin it back into spirit over letter, but Dave shook his head, unimpressed. "If it's on his land, then it's his pool. End of story," he said. Laughter rippled through the group, a burst of release that punctured her speech like a pin hitting a balloon. Suddenly other voices spoke. A woman laughed about Karen's 50-guest party that never was. Someone else muttered that it had been awkward bringing their kids there just to watch the gate slam shut in their faces. Karen's face flushed crimson, her finger tightening on the clipboard until her knuckles whitened. She turned sharply, jabbing that finger at me where I stood watching quietly, accusing me of orchestrating this, of mocking her, of turning people against her. But the truth was plain for everyone to see. She had built her own stage, and now she was tripping over it in real time. Finally, I stepped forward, calm, deliberate, holding a folder I had anticipated pulling out. I flipped it open and raised a copy of my property deed so that everyone could see the county seal at the top. My voice was steady when I said, "This is my land. This is my pool. You are welcome to visit as my personal guest if I invite you. But Karen has no authority to extend an invitation on my behalf." It was so simple, so clear, that it left no oxygen in the room for her bluster. Some neighbors clapped, others simply sat back satisfied, their curiosity met with clarity. But Karen was humiliated. She stammered, muttered about calling the HOA board, and finally stormed off again, red with anger, her voice carrying as she hissed, "This isn't over." Of course it wasn't. Within days, I received a formal complaint in the mail, clearly her handiwork, accusing me of failing to disclose construction of a shared amenity. It demanded I open the pool to all dues-paying members of the neighborhood. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it hadn't come wrapped in official letterhead. I made an appointment with Martin, the HOA president, an older man with patience etched into the lines of his face. When I showed him the deed and permits, he sighed, rubbed his forehead like a man too old for childish wars, and admitted Karen had been hounding the board relentlessly. "We'll dismiss this," he said, "but she won't stop. People like her don't stop until they've burned all their fuel." He was right. The flyers, the speeches, the whisper campaigns, none of it had deterred her, and none of it had scared me either. If anything, she was only digging herself deeper, one rumor at a time. By the end of that week, the neighborhood wasn't just buzzing, it was buzzing with conflict. Half the block kept replaying the clip of Karen yanking shamelessly at my pool gate, while the other half asked whether the HOA had rules buried somewhere that could justify her story. Curtains twitched when I walked the dog. Conversations stopped when I rounded corners. And though some mocked her openly, I could feel the seeds of division sprouting because lies stubbornly twist their way into weak minds. That was Karen's gift. She thrived on confusion, on dragging people into her storm until they couldn't see clearly. The flyers were just the beginning. The war of words had officially started, and while I had law, truth, and documentation, she had ambition, arrogance, and a voice loud enough to drown out reason in the ears of anyone willing to nod along. The pool might have been locked tight, the water calm and clear, but around it the air was rippling with Karen's noise. And deep down, I knew this was only Act 2 in a play that would spiral into something far messier before it was finished. It didn't take long for Karen to escalate from flyers and gossip to dragging in louder weapons. And by louder, I mean the police. I should have expected it after that little cul-de-sac performance where she sputtered red-faced when Dave asked the obvious question about who owned the land. She had taken that humiliation personally, and instead of swallowing it, she fed it into the fire of her delusion until it spat back out in the form of flashing lights in front of my property. The first time it happened, I was grilling on the deck, enjoying the quiet smell of charcoal and sizzling meat when I heard the unmistakable crunch of gravel tires and saw a squad car ease up to the curb across the street. Karen was already there, standing triumphantly with her arms crossed like a queen waiting for her knight to do her dirty work. She waved her hands dramatically, pointing to the pool, pointing to me, her voice shrill enough I could hear it from inside the fence. I put my spatula down, wiped my hands on a rag, and walked calmly to the gate, the padlock gleaming in the sun like a silent symbol of my sanity. The officer stepped out of the car looking tired already, sun in his eyes, notebook in hand. Karen launched first, practically shouting, "This man has locked up community property. He is depriving children of access to water in this heat." The officer held up his palm, asked her calmly if she had documentation that the pool belonged to the neighborhood. She fumbled, thrusting one of her crumpled flyers into his hands, muttering about HOA rules and spirit of community. The officer gave it a glance, then looked at me. I had been waiting for this. I simply pulled out the folder I kept close, my deed, my permits, the same stack I had shown Martin days before. I handed it across the bars, cool and polite. The officer flipped through, nodded once, and looked back at Karen with more sternness in his expression. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "this pool is not public. This is private property. He has every right to keep it locked." Karen's face was a study in cracking porcelain, her jaw clenched. Her eyes flitted nervously to the neighbors who had begun to linger, pretending to check mail or water flowers while watching the show. She sputtered about the HOA again, gesturing frantically, until the officer shut his notebook and told her bluntly that no homeowners association could override county deeds. Then, almost as a warning, he added, "And false reports waste resources that could be spent elsewhere. Please don't file them unless you have evidence." The car pulled away, and Karen slunk back across the street, her heels clicking sharp on the pavement, her face crimson with fury. I thought maybe that was it, that the taste of police dismissal would cool her down. But Karen was nothing if not relentless. The very next week it happened again. Another cruiser pulling up, another officer stepping out. Karen this time with a folder full of word salad she had printed from HOA newsletters, looking like she believed sheer paper volume could erase the truth. I gave the same calm demonstration, deed in hand, voice even, posture steady, while she flailed and shrieked about children suffering and community obligations. Neighbors gathered once more, some shaking their heads, some lifting their phones subtly to record, chuckling under their breath as she rambled herself deeper. This time the officer didn't just scold her. He warned her directly that continuing to misuse law enforcement for personal disputes could get her cited herself. That warning did not sit well with her. Her face burned red and she hissed at me through the bars, "You think you've won? This isn't over," before stomping away while the officer drove off. I might have let that be the end, except my cameras showed me something worse. That night, well after midnight, when the street was soft with the hum of crickets and the occasional bark of a distant dog, the motion light flared, and I opened my phone to the live feed. There she was, Karen, in black sweatpants and a hoodie, as if putting on cheap disguise made her invisible. She crept across the sidewalk to my gate, tugged softly at the chain locks, rattled them like a burglar testing a window, then unbelievably tried hoisting herself up the side like she thought she could climb over. Her sandal slipped in the first attempt. She tumbled back into the grass with a muffled grunt, scrambled up embarrassed, tried again, and finally, red-faced and panting, gave up and stumbled off into the night. I sat there half laughing, half seething with the recording glowing in my hand. The next morning I printed a still from the video, clear as daylight, her hand grasping my gate mid-climb, her face twisted in effort, her audacity laid bare. I slid the picture into an envelope and taped it to her mailbox across the street with nothing but a post-it that read, "Smile for the cameras." By mid-morning, the photo was gone, torn away by her trembling hands. But when I saw her that afternoon pacing across her lawn, eyes darting toward me and then away, I knew the message had landed. She realized this wasn't just her word against mine. Every stunt, every trespass, every shrieked accusation was being documented, archived, stitched into proof. And that rattled her, but it didn't stop her. If anything, it made her more reckless. She started pacing my street like a sentry, muttering under her breath when I watered flowers, hissing insults when I took the dog out, turning every mundane motion into another excuse to fuel her fury. It escalated again. One evening, just as the sun drew orange lines across the pavement, I saw the sheriff's SUV this time, not just a patrol car, pull slowly up the street. Karen strutted ahead of it, her arms flailing, pointing at me at my fence, shouting like she was narrating a crime documentary, her voice cracking with rehearsed outrage. The sheriff stepped out, same man who had been there the week before. His patience had lines etched across it. He looked tired, not just from work but from Karen specifically. She pounced, spouting words like discrimination, endangerment, tyrant. She accused me of hoarding water, hoarding luxury, painting herself as Joan of Arc in a pool war none of us had signed up for. The sheriff held up his hand, looked at me for my papers, and I obliged calmly, sliding them through the bars as I had before. He glanced once, handed them back, and turned to Karen with a voice sharper than I'd yet heard him use. "Ma'am, this is the third time. You have been told clearly, this is private property. If you continue to make false allegations, you could face legal consequences for misuse of services. Do not test this further." And then, to make sure his words reached heavier, he said it loud enough for the crowd that had by now openly gathered, neighbors with folded arms, neighbors with phones recording, some even laughing as Karen's protests sputtered into unintelligible gasps. She turned, shrieking at them, accusing everyone of conspiring, her finger stabbing the air, but no one came to her side. The laughs hurt more than my lock ever had. Phones caught it all. Her yelling, her face red, her flailing gestures. "Pool Karen," someone muttered. and the nicknames spread like wildfire, whispered and chuckled over fences, posted on message threads. By the time the sheriff drove away, clear disappointment on his face, Karen was left on the curb, trembling with rage, watching me walk back to my deck with the calm of a man who didn't need to argue. The pool shimmered behind me, unbothered. The same water that had started this ridiculous battle glinting in late sun, as though to say peace belongs to those willing to guard it. Inside, though, I knew this was not peace. This was escalation. She had been warned. She had been dismissed. She had been humiliated in front of neighbors with cameras. That kind of pride doesn't dissolve. It ferments. It steeps itself into something more bitter, more unpredictable. And when I reviewed the footage again of her trying to climb my fence in the middle of the night, smiling at how absurd she looked, I also felt a prickle in my bones. If she was willing to sneak and rattle chains after dark, what would be her next move? This wasn't just about a pool. It was about control. And Karen couldn't abide losing control on her own block. For me, the lesson was clear. Keep the chain tight. Keep the cameras rolling. Stay calm. Let her burn, because that's the thing no one ever tells people like Karen. What really destroys you isn't being shouted down. It's being laughed at, caught on record, mocked by the very crowd you wanted to impress. And by then, she had managed to hand me every piece of evidence I would ever need to show exactly who the trespasser was. Exactly who the fraud was. The law was on my side. The neighborhood was slowly tilting too. But Karen wasn't finished. She never was. She was only reloading, finding some new angle, some new stage to holler from, and standing there watching her mutter across her driveway, bruised ego radiating like heat. I could almost hear it coming. The next storm already whispering through her clenched teeth. The promise that the show would go on, no matter how many padlocks clicked between her and the prize she would never have. It started with the flyers again, though this time bigger, bolder, and dripping with the kind of delusion only Karen could summon. She had clearly gone to some copy shop in town, printed stacks of bright neon papers and plastered them into mailboxes, taped them to lampposts, and even pinned 2 on the HOA community board. In fat all-caps text was the announcement, "Official Community Pool Day hosted by Karen. Bring your families, towels, food, and good spirits. Location, my address. The HOA has arranged an unforgettable summer gathering at our community pool." Are in block letters. Beneath it, like an event itinerary, were bullet points. 12 p.m. gate opens. 1 p.m. kids swim contests. 3 p.m. barbecue. 5 p.m. raffle. At the bottom, a line that made me laugh out loud in my kitchen the first time I read it. Special thanks to our generous neighbor for providing his private pool as a community space. She had thanked me on paper for something I had fought her tooth and nail about for weeks. Something she had been publicly humiliated over 3 times in front of police and sheriff officers. But now she had upgraded her insanity. Now it was an official day, a proclamation with my home address proudly broadcast like an amusement park entry. I sat back in my chair, mug steaming, the flyer bright under the light, and I laughed the kind of laugh that's a little too sharp to be joy. 'Cause what it told me was 2 things. Karen wasn't just delusional. She was desperate. Every ounce of credibility that she had once wielded like a club was gone, shredded from her theatrics, her trespass, her calling police for false reports. Neighbors had laughed at her. The sheriff had scolded her. The internet had nicknamed her. She had no ground left, and yet pride will push people further than logic ever will. This flyer wasn't about truth. This flyer was about saving face. If she could gather a crowd again, if she could get bodies to march down to my gate, if she could posture even one more time in front of an audience, she could delude herself into thinking the score was still unsettled. For me, it was no longer even aggravating. It was entertaining. Because I knew what she had forgotten. The gate was stronger now, the lock tighter, the cameras sharper, the evidence deeper in my files. If Karen wanted to turn my Saturday into theater, then I was content to let her direct. The day came hot and clear, the sun blazing over rooftops like it had been booked special as stage lighting. I brewed coffee as usual, walked the perimeter, tested the keypad gate, steel sliding shut with that satisfying metallic sigh, checked the cameras, and then positioned myself with a tall glass of lemonade on my deck overlooking the pool. The water sparkled innocent, reflecting an empty blue sky. My dog lay at my feet, ears twitching lazily. and then faintly from down the street came the noise. Voices, giggles, the thud of sandals, the rolling rumble of coolers on wheels. The same parade as before, smaller this time, but still absurd. Families I recognized and strangers I didn't. Towels draped across shoulders, floaties squeaking, bags of chips crackling. And at the helm, as always, Karen. She had gone all in this time. Wide straw hat cocooned her face like a sun shield. A clipboard under her arm like she was running orientation at a summer camp. She blew a whistle once as if to keep a group in order. I nearly spit my drink watching her waving her hands like she was directing a marching band. "All right, everyone. Over here, let's get this set up. Don't worry, we'll be inside shortly." She strutted straight toward the gate, her entourage trailing, smiling and murmuring nervously as they caught sight of me cool as stone on the other side sipping my lemonade. I could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes between us as she reached the gate and grabbed the handle like she expected it would still swing free with her command. The handle rattled. The chain inside clanked brass. The red keypad light blinked silently. Nothing moved. Her smile froze like plaster cracking. She yanked again, harder, her face beginning to panic just at the edges. "There must have been some mistake," she mumbled loud enough for the crowd to hear. She spun on her heel, raised her voice bright. "The gate must have been relocked without authorization. Just give me a moment." She pulled at the chain again, futilely, tugging metal with bare knuckles. I let her stew. I sat on the chair as if I wasn't even bothered. The heat hummed, kids were growing restless behind her, and someone asked nervously, "Wait, isn't this his property?" Another muttered, "Did you actually get permission?" Karen rallied quickly, clipboard whipping out like a magician's trick. Of course, I arranged all of this with the board. This is our amenity, he changed the lock." Her voice thinned as she said it because she saw them turning, glancing back at me, at my calm stare, at the fortress lock they couldn't deny. And right then, as perfect timing could only design, Martin, the HOA president, came walking into view with 2 board members at his side. I had called him days earlier, shown him the flyer, asked him politely to show up so this nonsense could drown in its own arrogance. He wore a stone-set face, weary as though he'd had enough of this woman's delusion to last him a lifetime. "Everybody listen," he said, and silence prickled the air. "This pool is privately owned. It has nothing to do with the HOA. Karen had no right to invite you here, and this event is not sanctioned." His words were final, thick, cutting. A ripple of gasps spread through the crowd. A father holding his child turned on Karen immediately. "You wasted our Saturday." A mother shoved a folding chair back into her trunk and peeled away. Kids whined, trotting back behind parents. Cooler lids slammed. The crowd dissolved like sugar in hot tea. Some muttered mutinous insults as they passed, calling her a liar, a manipulator. Phones were already out too. I could see red dots of recording, neighbors whispering, laughter breaking quietly among them. And Karen stood trapped, jaw moving, ranting, clipboard shaking as hands betrayed her nerves. But it wasn't quiet enough for her. She screamed then in desperation, threw her voice up into the heat, pointing at me, accusing me of turning a neighborhood against her, accusing the HOA of being corrupt, accusing Martin himself of receiving bribes. "All of you, you're conspiring!" she shrieked, hair tumbling from her hat, face blotched crimson. Some actually laughed openly now, parents shaking heads. Even one teenager yelling, "Pool Karen strikes again!" And as if the moment could become even more cinematic, the sheriff's SUV rolled slowly into view. This time he hadn't been summoned by her, but by one of the disgruntled neighbors who had called in a public disturbance after the shouting began. The sheriff climbed out. Exhaustion burned into his walk, arms folded heavy. Karen immediately seized him like salvation. "Finally. Officer, he's locked the community out again. He can't do this. This is a public facility and he's—" The sheriff cut her off before I could even stand. He lifted the neon flyer, one that had been given to him on the roadside. "Karen," he said tiredly, "enough." He lifted his voice deliberately louder for the crowd, for ears recording on phones. "This is private property. He has every right to lock it. And you, ma'am, you do not have the right to keep doing this. If it continues, you'll be charged with disorderly conduct." The effect was devastating. Karen, for the first time, had no script. Her face twisted, contorted into something wild, and for a moment she lunged forward like she might actually shake the fence. But the crowd was finished. They turned, walked, left her standing alone at a locked gate with a clipboard no one respected anymore. Phones recorded silently as she shrieked hysterics, words lost into the noise of car engines retreating down the block. I stood, walked slowly up to the bars, and didn't even speak. I only looked at her, calm, steady, letting the silence smother her, because that was all it needed. She dropped her gaze first, her bluster deflated, then whipped around in defeat, stomping back across the street to her porch, muttering threats no one believed. And the sheriff shook his head, scribbled into his pad, reminded her one last time, and then drove off into heat shimmer. The street emptied. The hum lowered. The water in the pool caught the gold light of afternoon. I sat back down, lemonade sweating against the wood of the deck, my dog sighing heavy at my feet. It was over for now. Not over permanently, no, Karen wasn't a storm that died quick. She was a storm that recycled, that gathered, that reinvented her fury in new forms. But today, in front of the whole neighborhood, in front of the very board she claimed power from, in front of law enforcement itself, she had collapsed. Her credibility, once a false crown, shattered like glass. And as I drank in the calm, I reminded myself of the truth that had won each and every round. Sometimes you don't have to fight a battle at all. Sometimes all you have to do is lock the gate, sit back, and let arrogance destroy itself louder than you ever could. For the first few days after the community pool day fiasco, the street outside my house was eerily quiet. So quiet it felt unnatural. Karen's blinds stayed pulled tight. Her car didn't move, and not even her endless parade of gossiping friends came by anymore. Some neighbors whispered she might finally be finished, that maybe the sting of being humiliated publicly by the HOA president, the sheriff, and half the neighborhood all in one afternoon had silenced her for good. But I had been dealing with Karen long enough to know better. She didn't surrender. She simmered. Entitlement doesn't just dissolve. It ferments, it finds cracks to ooze through. I caught her curtains twitching at night whenever my pool light flickered on. Once or twice I spotted her shadow at the edge of her porch, her phone pressed tight to her face as if she were narrating her own twisted version of events to anyone unlucky enough to pick up the line. That silence was not retreat. It was plotting. The next sign came in an envelope thick with legal markings dropped onto my doorstep one Saturday morning. I carried it into the kitchen, sliced it open, and felt the ridiculousness drip right out of the pages. A lawsuit. Filed in Karen's name, written sloppily without real legal counsel, claiming that my pool was a public easement, that by locking it I was denying the neighborhood equal rights, and that I was guilty of infringing on community property by failing to disclose it properly. I actually laughed the first time I read it aloud, sharp, bitter laughter that made my dog cock his head in confusion. The language was so overblown, so bizarrely stitched together out of her same old talking points, that if it hadn't been bound with seals, I would have thought it was one of her flyers. Spirit of community, public good, unreasonable hoarding. The words meant nothing, not when confronted with truth on paper. Still, I didn't just laugh. I called my lawyer and laid everything on his desk. Deed, permits, receipts, photos, videos of her parades, her past accusations, even the footage of her rattling my gate in the middle of the night. He flipped through the stack, chuckling under his breath, and told me I had nothing to worry about. Judges don't deal in spirits of community, he said dryly. They deal in law, and she doesn't have any. Still, I felt the weight of nerves building. Karen wasn't foolish enough to think she'd actually win this lawsuit. She was doing it to waste my time, to sap my energy, to make me pay for her humiliation in hours and dollars. That was what she wanted, to prove she could still control the air around me, even if she couldn't touch the water in my pool. The day of the hearing came. I walked into the small county courtroom in a pressed shirt, my lawyer by my side, papers stacked neatly. Karen was already there, of course, dressed in an almost too bright blazer that screamed desperation. Her arms full of files she didn't understand, her voice spilling into the air before the judge had even seated himself. She waved hands full of HOA flyers, claimed loudly that the pool was visible from the street, which meant it was public, that the HOA granted her authority, that I had humiliated her, deprived her of rights. The judge's eyebrows climbed higher with every word out of her mouth. My lawyer stayed quiet until she finished, then simply stood, sliding the deed across with calm efficiency. He displayed permits, photographs of the property line, county stamps. The judge looked over the paperwork for less than 2 minutes before fixing Karen with a stern gaze and asking if she understood what private property meant. She stammered. She sputtered. She insisted the spirit of community mattered more than a piece of paper. He leaned forward then, his voice sharp. Courts do not deal in spirit, ma'am. They deal in law. He dismissed the case immediately, labeled it frivolous, warned her that if she filed anything like it again without hard evidence, she could face sanctions herself. The sound of the gavel cutting into wood was like thunder. The gallery chuckled. Karen's face collapsed inward, opening and closing like a fish gasping on a dock. I should have walked away from that courthouse with relief. Instead, I left with the distinct unease of someone who knew humiliation like that doesn't end the fight. It ignites it. Sure enough, the very next day she stormed into the monthly neighborhood meeting shouting about corruption, about bribery, about how everyone was in on the plot against her, about how I had paid off the judge and the HOA board, about how the truth would come out. Even people who used to nod politely at her now groaned, muttered, and left the room. Martin, the HOA president, finally told her bluntly that he would not entertain one more complaint about my pool, that she was wasting everyone's time, that enough was enough. She slammed the table, declared that everyone had turned against her, stormed out. And yet that wasn't even her lowest point. A few nights later, my cameras caught her again. This time not climbing, not rattling the lock, but tossing garbage bags. Heavy, clattering, splitting bags filled with empty cans, food wrappers, even shards of broken glass. Directly over my fence into the water. When I woke the next morning and saw my sanctuary polluted, I felt something sharper than anger. I felt the cold weight of how far she was sinking. I drained the pool, spending hours cleaning, the smell of rot mixing with chlorine until I got it back to the crystal clear water I loved. I turned the footage in to the sheriff. He paid her another visit. She denied it, shrieking that she was being harassed, that I had faked the video, but the sheriff's voice this time carried iron. This is your only warning left. Next time it's charges. The neighborhood saw the shift. Some mocked her openly. Some said she had lost it entirely. Kids on the block started calling her Pool Karen outright, singing Locked Out Karen when she passed by. She shouted threats at them, but the laughter followed her, trailing behind like cans on a trampled wedding car. She tried to scrape together one last desperate attempt at relevance by announcing another official community pool day online. This time bold enough to include more decorative graphics and hashtags. She even claimed she had worked it out with the HOA again, as though denial could rewrite the truth. But when Saturday rolled around, barely a dozen people showed up on the curb, squinting nervously at the reinforced steel gate, its keypad blinking, the cameras tilted like watchful eyes. I sat inside sipping iced tea, watching them like a scene from a theater. Karen strutted up again, pulled, rattled, shouted that something must be wrong with the lock. That was when Martin himself arrived, tired of her dragging the HOA's name through mud, and told the crowd there was no event. It was private property. She had lied again. The whispers grew venomous then. Neighbors turned their eyes on her, this time in anger. She wasted our time again. She tricked us. One by one, people peeled away, leaving her alone at the fence with no one left to command. But even then, she wasn't done. Karen never knew when to stop. The final collapse came the night of my own small pool gathering. Just a handful of friends and supportive neighbors. Food on the grill, music soft, kids splashing happily. The kind of summer moment I had dreamed about. The air smelled like burgers and sunscreen. The laughter of people I trusted filling the spaces where her voice used to creep. And then we heard it. A commotion near the gate. Karen's voice. Screeching, cursing. She was there again, alone this time, hair wild, eyes blazing, as though humiliation had driven her past reason entirely. She screamed that the neighborhood had betrayed her, that I had destroyed the spirit of community, and that she would take back what was hers. She rattled the gate violently with both hands, shaking it until the steel clanged like a bell. My guests froze, wide-eyed, until laughter broke out softly, then sharper as she screamed louder and louder, desperation drowning her words. Then, almost unbelievably, she climbed, in front of everyone, slipping, feet scrambling against bars, sandals catching, and then tumbling hard backward into the grass with a thud that silenced the air for a heartbeat. Neighbors gasped. Some stepped forward to help, but she popped up enraged, pointing a shaking finger at me. You set a trap. You'll regret this. Phones were out, recording every second, documenting her at the height of her absurdity. And it was in that exact moment that the sheriff's SUV rolled down again, steady, inevitable. The weight of law itself arriving like the final act of some cruel play. He stepped out, saw her, saw the crowd, saw the gate rattling still echo in its hinges, and he sighed. "Karen," he said, louder than her shrieks, "this is your final warning. You set foot on this property again, it's not just trespass. It's jail." She opened her mouth to argue, but his hand came up, firm and final. "Enough!" He looked at the crowd, at me, at the phone still blinking red, and the message was crystal. No one was fooled anymore. Not by her spins, not by her flyers, not by her shrieks. She stood red-faced, tears welling with rage or humiliation, maybe both, before storming off across the street, slamming her door so hard the glass of her windows trembled. The laughter that followed was relieved, triumphant, almost celebratory. People clapped me on the shoulder, congratulating me for never once letting her pull me into her madness, for holding the line with patience when anger might have turned me into her mirror. We celebrated anyway, maybe louder after she left. Music pouring, grill smoking, water splashing. The pool finally what I had always dreamed it could be. Private sanctuary, joyful gathering, free from her attempts to stain it. And as the sunset light dappling the blue water, I leaned back in my chair and realized something so obvious it almost made me smile. Karen lost not because I outshouted her, but because I never had to shout at all. I held the lock. I had the truth. And that was all it took. In the end, her whole war fell apart against steel and silence. My pool was mine, my boundary unbroken, and her name, once barked with fear by neighbors, was now whispered only as a joke. A story they'd retell for summers to come about the woman who tried to claim everything she could see and ended up locked out from the only place she truly wanted.